One of the things that we do, I've been at Purdue about 6.5 years now. I was 20 years at the University of California. So I have a lot of experience with field poultry medicine as well as with actual going out and doing diagnostic and research, etc. And so my position here at Purdue University is kind of my retirement position, and it is almost exclusively diagnostic, teaching, and service. With a little research component left in this. And with that, my instructions, because Dr. Willie Reed, who is our dean at Purdue University, he is one of my colleagues from many, many years. We've known each other about 30 years, and he is also a poultry veterinarian. And our program was kind of suffering at Purdue since the days when we had a pretty strong program when Raleigh Winterfield was there. And so I came in, and my job was to start back up with the teaching, start with service again, and get the poultry industry on board, which has been really a lot of fun, a lot of help, and pretty exciting. So what we have now is a program at Purdue. We have the only endowed residency program in the world, which means that we will always have poultry residents. And part of the endowment also covers training for senior veterinary students from not only Purdue University, but from wherever people want to come in from all over the United States, or actually all over the world as well. And so this is a 3-year program. My first resident is graduating this July. And she's actually going to become a professor at Iowa State University, so straight out of the residency program. So part of our training is that we take the students out in the field, and we do this about 50 times a year, 50 to 60 times a year. And we have students in 3-week blocks. So they come in and they're with me 24/7 for 3 weeks. These are senior vet students, or in addition, any veterinary students, even undergraduates as well. And we do farm visits. And about 40% of our farm visits are to backyard farms. And the reason for this is that you're all aware that most of us poultry veterinarians, we usually deal with predominantly commercial poultry. But there's more and more understanding, especially here in the state of Indiana, the impact of backyard farms on commercial poultry, and the real need for education and training in biosecurity and information for those backyard farmers. And one thing I have to say, I really love the backyard farm people. They're really enthusiastic. They all want to do good things for their poultry. The problem is the limited information that's out there, and not only limited information, but some pretty significantly wrong information that you can find on the internet and other places for poultry medicine. And so what I've got here is the list of different diseases. These are kind of it's what I call my top 10 list of poultry diseases that I find when I see the backyard flocks. And the first two, Coccidia and Marek's disease, those are definitely kind of flip-flop, 1-2, 1-2. Right now we're seeing more Coccidia than we're seeing Marek's. Usually starting in the spring, we see more Marek's than we see Coccidia. And Coccidia is more of a wintertime, fall to wintertime type of disease. And so when I take the students out with me, of course, we're all in our biosecurity gear, which sometimes really traumatizes our clients. We had one client that made us dress in our biosecurity gear behind the barn because he didn't want his neighbors thinking that he had a disease outbreak. And so he was pretty adamant that we not be observed. And it kind of uncomfortable because it was pretty high weeds out behind the back of his barn. And we come fully equipped for doing postmortems. We'll do the entire postmortem examination. We also, and this is a little bit hard to see here, but we're doing AI testing. So we use a direct antigen test that we can do directly on the farm. And one of the advantages that we have with being able to see these backyard farms is that we have premise points. So we work with the Indiana State Poultry Association. In fact, they are our cooperative funder for being able to take our students out. And actually all of these visits to backyard farms are compensated by Indiana State Poultry Association. so that we are able to do avian influenza testing and also able to provide biosecurity information for our backyard clients. So this is part of my resident and team that are working on doing the AI testing. And so just a little bit more, we have, one of the things that I like to teach the students, the majority of the students that ride with me are not going to become poultry veterinarians. They are going to be small animal veterinarians for the most part. Some of them will be food animal veterinarians. We get kind of a mix of different people. And the reason that it's really important for me to introduce them to going out to poultry companies, and we also go to, we at least see our 3 major industries in the state of Indiana, and that is duck production. We are Indiana's #1 in ducks. We are #3 in table egg production, so we always go to both caged and non-caged production. And then we either do one of the meat birds, which is either turkeys, which is in southern Indiana, or broilers, which we have a small broiler company that's in central Indiana, north central Indiana. So they have the opportunity to know what we do as poultry veterinarians. This is really important because, as you probably all know, being in animal agriculture, we have issues that come up in front of AVMA on a regular basis, such as forced molting, that we need people to understand, small animal vets to understand. Also, it's the small animal veterinarian that's going to be looking at these birds, these backyard birds. There's not too many of me around that will be poultry vets that have the time or the ability to be able to cross into the backyard area. So with Coccidia, I'm kind of giving you my top 3 reasons for why we're seeing these particular issues. And the reasons for Coccidia is crowding. So people start out, I don't know if you've seen in the, on the internet, you can get yourself a temporary poultry house. So you can, you can rent it complete with chickens, and you can bring it to your home, and you can have the chickens wandering around, and it's a tiny, tiny little house, and it has 5 chickens in it. It's really only set up for 1. And then you can decide whether or not you want to go into having backyard chickens, and so then you have to stop renting and buy your own chickens. Now, can you imagine the disease opportunities that this creates with rental chickens going into one place after another place after another place, and the unit coming with it? So it's kind of a nerve-wracking thing. Poor clean out, because a lot of the people start out, this is for 4-H or for other things. They're going to, a good thing for their kids to do. And as any of you who have children, the interest kind of slides a little bit once the novelty wears off. And we see a lot of issues with that, particularly in the winter, with people not wanting to clean out the houses. And organic feed. Now, one of the things that I find with going into the backyard poultry industry is that they don't know what organic feed is, but organic is a popular term right now, so they want their chickens to be organic. So they buy the organic feed without realizing that it has no preventive for Coccidia, or, and it's mainly because they don't want antibiotics. Well, technically, Amprolium is an antibiotic, but it's not an antibiotic that's of human concern. And so we see a lot of people using either local feed that's a lot of times not mixed to proper concentrations of nutrients, or we'll see that they're using organic feed without knowing the consequences. So to give you an example, this is a flock of chickens that I see on a regular basis, and here we've got, I think at that time they had about 80 chickens, and that's the house. So in the wintertime, when you're moving these birds into that house, you can probably tell that 80 chickens in that house. And of course, they don't want the chickens going out in the wintertime because they're worried about them getting cold. And of course, they close up all the ventilation. And I end up with lots of blood on the walls. Usually when we're talking about Coccidia, we're talking about Tenella. And Tenella causes a pretty significant bloody diarrhea. So from that particular, this is another farm that I went to. I cleaned all the chickens out, or I moved all except for these 2. And you can see the amount of manure that's on the floor with actually no litter down on the floor at all. So we don't have anything to protect them from consuming the litter. And these 2 birds have Coccidia, and there you can see the pasting of the vents. And actually, Coccidia has a pretty high mortality rate. If any of you haven't worked with it, we are seeing with Tenella, I can see 50% of the flock gone within the first couple of weeks if it's not treated. And we treat both with either amprolium, which is, of course, labeled for poultry. Albon is not labeled for poultry, but for our small animal veterinarians, Albon is their medication of choice. And to let you know that if easy, amprolium, of course, interferes with hemorrhagic, overdosing. It causes hemorrhagic diathesis, and it doesn't take much of an overdose to do this. So you have to be really careful calculating. And the way I know this is when I was training to be a poultry veterinarian, I was at Michigan State, and my husband is not a veterinarian. In fact, he's here with me because he was my driver today. We had a small farm, and I had chickens, and they got coccidia. And I went in and I talked to the poultry people, and together we calculated the dose, and I made a 1 decimal error. Gave them 10 times the amount of medication. They all died, pretty instantly died. And as I came home the day after medicating them, my husband, we had a 300-foot long driveway, and he lined up all the dead chickens along the driveway. So the first thing I would see driving home was the chickens, dead chickens. And I walked in the door, and he looked at me with disgust, and he said, "And you call yourself a poultry veterinarian?" So let me tell you, you can really make mistakes on that, and we urge caution and lots of advice for our vets that are working with our poultry clients. Marek's disease, this is my favorite. Marek's is a herpes virus. It causes tumors. We would not have been able to have raised birds in confinement if we hadn't had vaccination for Marek's disease. In the U.S. at least, all of our birds are vaccinated for Marek's, both laying birds and broilers. And it's because the intensity in which we raise, and it's transmitted by feathers and dander. So it's really impossible to clean out. Once you've got Marek's, then you're going to have to vaccinate. And no clean out is going to take out every bit of dander. One example I use is that even in high security buildings, one of the times I was working with people that were doing testing, they kept having their negative controls get infected, and the problem was that this was it was a HEPA filtered BL3 building. It was cement with epoxy paint. It was perfect. It had alcove and everything, but the lamp that they used for the baby chicks was plugged into the wall and had a cap, and so they would pull up the cap, plug in the lamp. Nobody cleaned the inside of underneath the cap, and so every time you pulled up that cap, the dander would fall out, and the chicks that were in there that were the negative controls would get infected. So it's a pretty transmissible disease. One of the problems that we have in backyard industry is that some of our hatcheries, and Mount Healthy Hatchery, which I am sorry if there's any of you that know Mount Healthy or are associated, it's in Ohio. They've been telling their customers to not vaccinate for Marek's because it's only a disease of commercial industry. Well, if you know Mount Healthy, they're also the one that over the past few years, CDC has traced back salmonella in children from baby chicks at Rural King and Tractor Supply and places like this that are selling baby chicks. And of course, the little kids go in there and they kiss the baby chicks and they end up getting salmonella. Montevideo was the last one that they had traced back there. And I was really my daughter, she's 27. We just went to Rural King about a week ago, and I saw that they had the baby chicks out and they weren't covered. And so the little kids were standing there, and I was horrified as being a poultry vet. And so I went up to the manager, and I said, "Do you understand that if you have children that are picking up these birds, that they can get salmonella, and that could be, a lawsuit?" And my daughter walked away, and she instantly texted one of her friends that I was creating a scene in the Rural King. So, it's kind of awkward to have a mother as a poultry vet. Now here, this is something this is one of the first things that I start to see. We hardly ever see eye lesions in commercial industry, but in backyard I see a higher percentage of eye lesions, and this is just starting on this rooster here. He's actually a show rooster, and this was right before he was going to go to show, and I'm looking at the eye and I went, oh no. So because what we're seeing is this, what you see right here is the pupil is not completely around. And even with, and we've shown a light in it, it would not respond to light. So that's the first thing that we start to see, and then eventually that pupil will gray. And then once you have clinical signs, morbidity equals mortality. You're not going to be able to save the bird. And this is kind of not the best of pictures. It was taken by my client while we were doing the postmortem. This was one of the birds that actually had an enlarged crop. And the second picture will show that enlarged crop. And that's one of the most common things that I see in backyard poultry as a sign of Marek's, because the Marek's virus gets into the vagus nerve. Once it gets into the vagus nerve, their peristalsis is gone. And so they fill up, and a common question is, oh, I've got grass crop. Well, you know, the only thing that I know that, other than that, this right here for causing grass crop is candida, and that's usually in a really poorly managed farm where we see quite a bit of biofilm in the water, etc. So that's one of the others, and that's number 1 and 2 kind of go back and forth. Now MG, I can tell you that this is the most frustrating one for me, and that's because we have no MG-free source of backyard poultry. So if you look at Murray McMurray, or if you look at any of the hatcheries that sell that are larger hatcheries that sell exhibition birds, which is this under NPIP, this comes under exhibition birds. They are NPIP cleared, but they're NPIP cleared for Pilarum and Gallinarum, and so they're NPIP cleared for avian influenza, but not for Mycoplasma. So unlike our commercial industry where we have Mycoplasma-free birds that in source, and anybody that's NPIP is a Mycoplasma-free source, that's not available to our backyard people. And once they get it, it's impossible to get rid of if you maintain the flock. So depopulation, and when you're talking about a 4-H flock that may have 100 plus birds, and you're talking about depopulation, and watching the kids crying when they're seeing their birds depopulated, it's really an issue. And so exposure, we have a place called Dinky's Auction here in Indiana. Oh my God, I wouldn't buy anything at Dinky's Auction, but everybody sells whatever you want at Dinky's Auction, pretty much you can get. And I try to train my people, my clients, that if you buy a bird at auction or at a show from a show barn, the people who are selling them are selling the ones that are not their good birds. They're the ones that aren't laying, that are sick, or for other reasons aren't conformation proper, are mixed breeds, etc. So I encourage them to actually go out and look at these birds. So we had one of the most frustrating still going on in Sunman, which is down almost near Cincinnati. We had a woman who had purchased, of course, if you live in Indiana, Kentucky is where everything bad comes from. I'm sorry to say this if anybody's from Kentucky. In fact, when I first moved out here, since I'm not an Indiana native, actually I'm a Texas native, when I first moved out here, I had an elderly farmer, and I went out and he had maybe one tooth, and he's looking at me, he goes, "Doc." I said, "Yes." And he goes, "I got something to tell you." He says, "Who's the poorest person in Kentucky?" He says, "The tooth fairy." And I went, okay. So again, whenever I go and I see a disease issue, almost everybody claims that the disease was brought in from a bird they bought from Kentucky. Well, this particular lady said that she bought these birds from Kentucky. She had turkeys, and she knew they were sick. Because they were big fat faces, kind of like what you're seeing here, and another one right here. Fat faces on them is pretty common for what we see with MG, and they were dying, and yet she sold to 5 different 4-H kids a single turkey, all right? And each of these 4-H kids had a number of birds of different kinds. Of course, MG can go into pheasants, it can go into chickens, it can go into ducks, it can go into any number of birds. And here I am out there telling these poor kids that they've lost their entire flock, that if they want to be able to continue with a a flock that isn't going to have issues, they're going to have to start over. And the lady said, well, she would replace the turkey. Well, you know, a $5 turkey is no replacement for an entire flock of birds. And it's so frustrating. We can vaccinate, but the vaccine won't stop or prevent infection from being transmitted to new birds coming in. So if you want to bring in new birds, or if you want to hatch new birds, you're going to have to depopulate and start over. And this is one of my other farms that is kind of a, this is the Tippecanoe River, and the man lives here. These are breeders, and this floods about 3 times a year, and he and his family move, and the chickens move up to higher ground in a trailer and wait for the floods to go down and then come back down again. Well, this is kind of a hot button area for about every disease that I've seen, and you'll see this particular farm come up again, but Mycoplasma is one of the big issues that he's had here. Another one that I had just recently, and one that really concerned me, because we've had 2 instances in the state of Indiana since I've been here of Mycoplasma being transmitted from backyard farms to commercial turkeys. Indiana MG is a reportable disease in turkeys, and it requires depopulation. So you're looking at a significant amount of loss. So this is a farm that's actually just over the border in Ohio, and actually is fairly close. It's within a mile of Cooper Farms, which is a commercial turkey and chicken operation. And this particular farm was with pheasants. They were raising all different kinds of pheasants, and I'll show you the picture of the pheasant, but here's what I found inside the barn where the pheasants are at. A bunch of pigeons. And when I looked at the man, I said, you got feral pigeons? He goes, oh, I was going to shoot them. He said, but I haven't gotten around to it yet. So it's one of the ways that we get that in there, and it's kind of a fuzzy shot, but not only do you have pigeons, but he had ducks running around on the floor around his specialty birds, which is here's his part of his pheasant operation, and he had some pretty expensive breeds. And if you get a breeding pair of Amherst pheasants, they run about $1,500. So you're talking about a fairly expensive bird. And this is one of the pheasants that we had that was positive for MG. And so we've got pigeons that can bring this to any other operation that's in the area. We've got mixed birds that are here in this particular facility, and he is selling these breeding pheasants. So he's spreading the disease elsewhere. Avian encephalomyelitis, and if there's any questions, please let me know, because obviously we have a fairly small group, so I don't mind the questions. Avian encephalomyelitis, the main reason for us to see this particular disease is that the way you prevent AE is by vaccinating the hens. In commercial industry, we vaccinate all the hens, and so we don't have avian encephalitis. In fact, it's been probably 20 years since I've seen an outbreak of avian encephalomyelitis in commercial industry. What his problem is that if you're getting your birds from Rural King or Tractor Supply, whoever's selling those birds to Rural King or Tractor Supply is never going to meet you. And if they're never going to meet you, why should they vaccinate their hens for a disease that they're never going to deal with? Because they're not raising the chicks. They're selling the chicks. They only have the hens. And so they don't get vaccinated. And what happens is that we get these 50-60% of the flock dies within the first 3 weeks. And these birds it's called crazy chick disease, and part of it is because they spin on their backs, they can't stand up, they can't feather appropriately. And the survivors will be blind. A lot of them will be blind, and the progeny of the survivors also can be blind, which means that if you're purchasing these birds for a breeding purpose, then it becomes an issue with not only the first generation but for generations to come. And one of the things that I see is not only they spinning on their backs, but pasted vents are really common, along with avian encephalomyelitis. Pox, it depends on how bad your mosquito population is. And if you live in Michigan, which is where I grew up, mosquitoes are about the size of small birds. They will carry you away if possible. And so these birds are often not vaccinated for pox because, again, people aren't up on biosecurity. And they're kept outdoors, and again, this will come up with avian influenza, is that there's usually a water source nearby. So we start out, generally what we see is the pox will be on the comb and then on the wattles, and we can see it move farther from that into the throat, and that's usually with wet pox, that's usually where we see deaths. And again, pox has a number of different, we have turkey pox, we have cytosine pox, we have canary pox. We just have a client that is losing all his canaries from canary pox, and again bought one from a show and brought a canary in and then started losing his entire population. Canary pox has about 100% mortality. It's really vicious. Usually we don't see that with fowl pox or even with things like a raptor pox and turkey pox. Although cytosine pox and blue front Amazons is another one that can pretty much take out your entire population. So parasites, I got lots of pictures of parasites here. People don't notice them. I'm not sure why, but they don't notice them because my students, when they go to pick up the birds, they notice them real quick, crawling, and it kind of gives you that creepy feeling because I went out to one place and the man had just had knee surgery, just like me, and so I was picking up and treating all of his birds, and about halfway through I realized I was getting covered with red mites. And by the time I was done, even though I was in Tyvek, they crawl up, and they can go right in through the seams on the Tyvek suits, and they'll crawl up the sleeves. And I must have had 200 at least mites on me. And when I took off the suit and was giving him his instructions, they were falling off my head. It was really kind of, for me, one of those times where you just wanted to run and jump into the nearest source of water you could find. One of the issues that we have, this is lice. This is one of my backyard people. When you get lice to this extent, this obviously is a dead bird, and actually it died of lice. When you get lice to this extent, the anemia is going to be so bad that you're going to lose the birds. Usually we don't see them this bad, but you can see them, they're all leaving, like rats leaving a sinking ship. They're all kind of taking off there. This is more typical of what we see. This is one of our backyard birds where we see the nits. It's a little unusual place to have it on the neck. We usually see it more on the belly, or we see it around the tail and tail head for lice. Lice are an obligate parasite. They're not going to go on you for very long, and they're not going to bite you. And they're easy to see because they're an obligate parasite and have to stay on the bird. When you're talking about northern fowl mite, and it's a little harder to see, but there's a mite right here, and there's a mite right here, and actually there's nits from lice down here. The northern fowl mite doesn't have to stay on the bird, neither does the red mite. And so if you see a population on the bird, then that generally means that the population is pretty significant in the barn itself. Now, ordinarily, for years I said that northern fowl mites and mites in general would not bite you, until I got a cast on my arm. I'd broken my wrist, and I had started a cast from here to here, and my arm was bent. It was a great place to tuck chickens when I was doing, taking blood, and I was showing a bunch of people from USDA how to draw blood, and the birds had mites. Well, the mites crawled up inside my cast, and they bit. And they bit for about 5 hours, and if any of you have had casts, you know how insane that can make you. And the orthopedist, when I went in to have when this happened, the mites were all dead, but he didn't believe it. He double gloved. He wouldn't even really touch. He was kind of like had his hand way out here. So I will tell you that mites will bite you if you have something constricting on that keeps them from moving. One of the other things that we see is this right here is we have chickens. As you can see, there's a chicken right here, and then we've got pheasants, and we actually had goats and all kinds of creatures in this particular farm. And what we found on necropsy of a bird that was having problems. These are real typical roundworms. And then the owner was actually kind of weird because she was excited to see them moving. She wanted to pick them up and carry them over to the neighbor and let the neighbor watch the worm move. Usually people are kind of grossed out. It's one of my favorite diagnoses because when you open up and the worms start like crawling out, people are usually like, okay, we'll treat. The problem with it is, though, the only medication that we really have that's labeled for poultry is piperazine, wazine. Safeguard is one of the ones I do use, and I will use ivermectin off-label in certain circumstances. but for people over the counter. And I don't know how much experience any of you have with piperazine, but when I was getting my PhD, and I had a big party, and we had that small farm, and as I said, my husband's not a veterinarian, and he's actually in the arts, so he doesn't like gross things. And it's horrible to have a wife who's a pathologist, because people used to deliver like carcasses to our garage and that for me to take into work, and he was never thrilled with that. But we were going to have a big party for my PhD, invited my parents and friends and everything, and about 50 people, and my dad and mom had come over to stay overnight, and somebody, one of my dogs or cats, I'm not sure who, had thrown up a roundworm right outside their door. It's just, they do that on purpose. And so I lined them all up, and I hit them all with piperazine, and everybody's all ticked off because they got hit with piperazine. And right about the time that the barbecue is ready, and we're all sitting in chairs, I hear this blood-curdling scream. And here comes one of my cats around the corner, and she's got live tapeworms about this long hanging out of her rear end, 9 of them. And of course, everybody looks, and she ran under my chair, and I did what I think every veterinarian would do. I went and I grabbed the tapeworms, and she went, wow, and up in the air and took off, and I had a fistful of live tapeworms, and it ruined the party. My husband didn't speak to me for months because of this incident. And what piperazine will do is it'll stun tapes. And so the tapeworms, and this is one of our backyard flocks, and these are all tapeworms in here. The tapeworms will come out whole because it'll stun and they'll release, and they'll come out whole in the stool. So sometimes people will call me in a panic because they'll actually see all of these kind of horrible, squirmy-looking things in the stool. Favus. I haven't seen Favus since I hadn't seen Favus at all until I started seeing backyard flocks. And Favus is, of course, a public health disease. It's ringworm, poultry ringworm, and it's a re-emerging disease, and I've now seen it in about 8 operations, and one of the operations, the child actually got Favus. And it's usually because coops are dark and poorly maintained, so I'm going to show you a couple of really dark coops, like back in here. This is the only access to light that they had. This is another one where the birds are kept indoors. There's only one source of light, which was a small light bulb. The light that you see right here, that was from my flashlight, looking at these particular birds, and you can see it's a fairly dirty sort of maintained operation. And this is what we see. It kind of smells like a seborrheic dog, wet dog. And we see kind of a crusty, you can have the entire chicken looking like this or only parts of the chicken. Very important if these are around kids that it get treated. We don't have any approved treatments, but I will use some of the treatments that we can use for small animals. And it usually responds pretty well. It's not like ringworm in cats where you have recurrence and difficulties getting rid of it. Histomonas. And of course I tell all of my clients, do not mix species. Do you think they listen? No. So usually what I say is, do not put at risk your most expensive birds or your most emotionally expensive birds. If you've got a pet that you really love, then you probably ought to be keeping that one separated from everybody else. And to let you know, I had a client in California. She had a single chicken, Elvis. He's the oldest bird I've ever had. He lived to be 17. He had his own seat at the San Francisco Opera. He liked Pagliacci. She had she swam with him every day. He had custom-made water wings. He had designer diapers. DKNY and Izod make designer diapers. He had his own flat-screen TV. And the reason I saw him was he was tearing holes in the waterbed with his spurs. She wanted to have his spurs removed surgically. So here I was. I'm a pathologist. You know, the worst thing to have working on you. I mean, I wouldn't want a pathologist as a surgeon. You know, we have an ulterior motive when we're doing stuff. And I didn't ever ask her whether he had his own waterbed or if he shared one with her. But anyway, these are things you don't get into. So if you have a bird like this, you don't want to be mixing it with other birds. So mixed species, wet ground, earthworms can be, heterachus is one of the chicken cecal worm is one of the sources of histomoniasis. And there is no preventive medication that we have. And so when you're talking about mixed species, it's not just other poultry, it's cats that are in there. And this is one of my commercial farms, commercial duck farms, and I will never tell you who it is. The ducks are in here. I got a cow right here, and I got chickens right there, and I just shake my head. And then raising, here we've got a duck, and then we've got chickens, and so this is the farm that I have most issues with. It has chickens and turkeys. The turkeys are kind of back in here. This is what we see, bullseye lesions in the liver, very, very common. This is a turkey post-mortem. And the Zika, very, very heavily involved. Now, the medication, obviously we have no medication left for this. But if you call up, this particular client of mine called up the source of where she had purchased the turkeys, the poults, and they recommended ick medication for fish. Now, I'm not an aquatic veterinarian, and I have no idea how much ick medication you would give. However, she got a bottle and she poured the entire bottle down the turkey's throat, and the turkey went and fell over dead. So, it was too much, yes. So how do you advise on things like this? I mean, and the only thing I can say is she's not going to be able to keep turkeys anymore. Pretty much that's the conclusion we're going to have to come to. SE I don't see very often. But I do see it, and the problem that I find, and I'm a cancer survivor as well as having a bad knee, and I won't buy locally. And the reason I won't buy locally eggs and things like this is that they're not tested. If any of you know, we don't test anything under 3,000 birds. And in addition, I've had 3 cases in Indiana here of children getting lead poisoning from eating eggs from birds on their own farm. And 2 cases, the children were permanent brain damage from lead poisoning. And so these are issues people don't understand, is that, we're going to go buy local, but I don't know what those birds are getting into or eating or where they've been. And so and we don't do any testing. Unless we do have in Indiana here, we call the T12 program, and people can send in 12 eggs, and into our lab. It's free. It's covered by Indiana State Poultry Association. We test for Mycoplasma, we test for avian influenza, and we test for salmonella. And so once a year they can get this free service done. But that's only a once a year kind of testing, and not everybody uses it. And of course there's no vaccination. So remember that Tippecanoe River farm? This is the bird that had Salmonella enteritidis. And the man had 6 children. Pretty poverty-stricken area, and he had his little young boy was there. He's only about 4 or 5 years of age, and I was standing out there with my students, and I talked to I was talking to his child, and I said, well, when you handle the chickens, you have to make sure you wash your hands after handling the chickens every time, because the chickens can give you different diseases. And so he looks at me, and then he goes, and then dries his hands on his mother's dress and goes, I wash. And I went, ugh, like this. And I thought the students were going to pass out. So it is a significant issue. And because we're going to have an AI lecture, I will talk about, as I said, we know our premise points here in Indiana of our backyard birds. AI is something that we're all worried about. I am now being questioned on the chicken blog about avian. I mean, I don't blog, but they send me questions about what should we do, how do we handle this, and the more information we can give them, the better, because people don't know. And when the birds die, they don't do necropsies, especially if they have to pay. And in certain states, you do have to pay, and it can be a significant amount of money. They throw them in the woods, and then coyotes get them, and other animals get them, and they're being dragged someplace else. And in Coccidia County here in Indiana, there's so many poultry you can spit and hit somebody. I mean, it's just packed with commercial poultry as well as backyard poultry. Very, very high significance. And so I'm trying to work with people to make sure they get a hold of us when they have a death. And as you can see here, they're wandering everywhere. This is one of the towns, and you can see they're just wandering around the town. These are people's chickens. They're not town chickens. These are owned, but they go everywhere, and people think that's kind of funny. But it doesn't become funny when it becomes the source, and particularly here with when we're talking about restrictions on trade, we have, as we said, #1 in ducks, and if we stop being able to send duck overseas, that's going to kill our duck industry because that's where most of it goes. So in conclusions, increasing in number. We've got to work with people and promote our small animal and our food animal vets to work with them, and huge variation in management skills. And antibiotics, I got 5 maybe that I can use, and most of them don't work very well anymore. And many states don't have money for indemnity. We don't here in Indiana. When we had the instances with infecting the commercial flocks, it was the commercial companies that actually indemnified the people to depopulate their flocks. And owners can be resistant to depopulation. The one flock that we had to depopulate, the owner met me with a gun, and he was not going to have that done. And when I was in California during the Newcastle outbreak, I used to have a sheriff go with me to some of these backyard or fighting cocks. We had a lot of fighting cocks in California when we had to go for depopulation, and because of the resistance. And mobile population, it is very mobile. People are driving them everywhere. So it's and a lot of times not much common sense that goes along with it. One of the things you see is coop and wine tours. Now, I can't imagine a worse combination than coop and wine tours. And I want to thank my students and Dr. Mike Kopp, who's from the Board of Animal Health, and Dr. Jim Combs, and Donna Schrader, who's my tech. And I thank you all. And if you have questions, I'm going to have to leave because I have physical therapy to go to. And so if you have any questions, please ask me now. And thank you again.